nuclear-powered aircraft carriers, over 200 aircraft, and more than 15,000 American sailors and Marines are being concentrated around a single 21-mile-wide chokepoint that is, right now, up to 90% blocked to commercial traffic by a regional power that spends barely 3% of what the United States does on defense. And yet, on paper, Washington is talking about de-escalation, and the President of the United States is openly saying he might walk away from a direct fight with Iran, even as the USS George H.W. Bush, the third carrier, surges out of Norfolk toward the Strait of Hormuz. This is not a coincidence. This is a pattern. At current market prices, the hardware now converging on Hormuz represents well over $30 billion of capital ships alone, not counting escorts, aircraft, and munitions. The USS Abraham Lincoln, on a Nimitz-class supercarrier, cost roughly $4.5 billion to build. The USS Gerald R. Ford, the lead ship of her class, cost over $13 billion, making it the most expensive warship in human history. The USS George H.W. Bush, CVN-77, the last of the Nimitz class, sits in the $6 billion range. For that price, you could buy entire national air forces. And yet, all of that steel is now being funneled toward a narrow stretch of water that Iran claims it can shut down with cheap subsonic anti-ship missiles that cost around $1 million apiece. On the surface, the math doesn't work. And this is where the equation breaks. Before we break down exactly how this happened, we have a quick request. You are watching a brand new channel. Our dedicated team is working over 12 hours a day, every single day, without rest, to bring you the highest quality military analysis on YouTube. Our immediate goal is to reach our first 1,000 subscribers to monetize the channel and fund this research. If you want to support real tactical breakdowns, please hit that subscribe button. It means the world to our team. Here's the surface-level picture most people see. First carrier, the USS Abraham Lincoln, already in theater, operating under U.S. Central Command as the primary visible symbol of American power opposite Iran. Second carrier, USS Gerald R. Ford, recently sidelined by a non-combat onboard fire that temporarily disrupted flight operations and forced a maintenance stop in the Mediterranean. Third carrier, USS George H.W. Bush, departing Norfolk after completing pre-deployment workups, officially as a regularly scheduled deployment, but in reality reinforcing a growing carrier stack pointed directly at the Gulf. 3 carriers, 3 strike groups, 1 congested maritime choke point. It looks like overkill. It looks like escalation. It looks like the opposite of walking away. The system was never designed for this. To understand why the Navy is doing this, you have to start with the battlefield geometry. The Strait of Hormuz at its narrowest is about 21 miles across. The deep-water shipping lanes, the ones supertankers rely on, are even narrower. Oil flows in and out of the Persian Gulf through defined traffic separation schemes that are easy to surveil, easy to range, and easy to target. Iran doesn't need to control the whole Gulf to cause chaos. It just needs to make a handful of shipmasters and insurance companies believe that passing through Hormuz is suicidal. In economic terms, the strait is a single point of failure, and in military terms, it is a constrained kill box. This is not a coincidence. This is a pattern. Now overlay that geography with carrier physics. A Nimitz-class carrier like the Bush or the Lincoln displaces around 100,000 tons, moves at over 30 knots, and typically operates its air wing from standoff positions outside the most dangerous coastal missile envelopes. In a normal peacetime show of force scenario, the carrier doesn't need to steam into the narrow throat. It can sit in the Arabian Sea or the Gulf of Oman and still launch aircraft that can reach critical targets ashore. But this is not a normal scenario. Reports indicate the strait is up to 90% blocked to commercial traffic. Iran has fired or threatened to fire on shipping, and has publicly warned the USS Abraham Lincoln against entering what it calls its strike range. At this point, mere presence at a distance no longer changes behavior. It just signals intent. And this is where the equation breaks. The hidden problem is endurance under saturation. On paper, a single U.S. carrier strike group is designed to project overwhelming air power, conduct sustained sorties, and defend itself and nearby shipping against missiles, aircraft, and submarines. In a normal crisis, 1 carrier is enough. 2 carriers are a message. But facing a determined Iranian strategy built around layered anti-ship missiles, cheap drones, fast attack craft, and theater ballistic missiles, The core American vulnerability isn't firepower, it's continuous coverage. The system was never designed for this. Look at sortie generation. The USS George H.W. Bush, as a Nimitz-class carrier with steam catapults, can push well over 120 sorties per day at surge tempo when heavily tasked. That means 120 takeoffs and recoveries of FA-18S, EA-18G Growlers, E-2D Hawkeyes, and helicopters in a 24-hour cycle. The USS Gerald R. Ford, with its advanced EMALS electromagnetic catapults and AAG arresting system, was designed to surpass Nimitz-class sortie rates by about 30% at lower maintenance cost. But EMALS is still a relatively new technology. After the recent fire aboard Ford and the repairs in Suda Bay, the ship may be fully mission-capable on paper, but commanders will be cautious about stressing the system at the absolute limits until they are confident the fault trees are clean. Reliability in combat isn't about the spec sheet. It's about known performance under sustained stress. This is not a coincidence. This is a pattern. Now add Marines. Amphibious ready groups like those centered on ships such as USS Tripoli and USS Boxer add another dimension: vertical envelopment and limited amphibious raids. If planners are even considering operations against Iranian positions on Karg Island or coastal missile sites, they need persistent air cover above the Marines, plus suppression of enemy air defenses, plus anti-ship screening against fast attack craft and missile boats. That means fixed-wing strike, rotary wing, and ISR platforms in the air almost constantly. One carrier can surge for a few days, 2 carriers can rotate and sustain, 3 carriers create something else, overlapping 24/7 coverage that survives damage, system failure, or sudden escalation. Why is that necessary here? Because Iran's strategy around Hormuz is asymmetric and attritional. For the cost of a single modern American destroyer, roughly $2 billion, Iran can field hundreds of Noor, Qadr, or Qadr derivative anti-ship cruise missiles. Each missile might cost in the low millions. A Noor, based on the Chinese C-802, has a range of roughly 120 kilometers, subsonic speed, and uses sea-skimming flight profiles to complicate detection. Iran can hide them in coastal launchers, on islands, in trucks, even on small ships. The U.S. answer to that is the Aegis combat system and the SM-2 or SM-6 family of missiles, each interceptor costing $4 to $5 million or more. One side is shooting million-dollar arrows at multi-billion-dollar targets. The other side is shooting multi-million-dollar shields at those arrows. But economically, this looks insane, and this is where the equation breaks. Consider a single engagement. Iran launches a salvo of 20 Noor missiles from dispersed coastal batteries and small vessels at a carrier's escort line at around 200 kilometers range. Each Noor costs, say, $1 million. That's $20 million worth of offensive fire. To maintain a high probability of kill, U.S. destroyers might fire 2 SM-6 missiles at each inbound. At roughly $4 million each, that's $8 million per target, $160 million total in defensive missiles, plus the wear and tear on radar, launchers, and crew fatigue. The cost-exchange ratio is completely upside down. In classic terms, the defender loses money every time he wins tactically. This is not a coincidence. This is a pattern. But it gets worse. Those 20 missiles don't have to sink a carrier to win strategically. They just have to force the carrier group to maneuver defensively, break off air operations at a critical moment, or convince insurers and tanker companies that the risk is unacceptable. Truck-mounted launchers can be hidden in coastal clutter, moved between civilian buildings, and fired in coordinated waves. Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy fast boats can add unguided rockets, lightweight torpedoes, or even suicide drones to saturate defenses. In that environment, the real constraint is not U.S. technology. It's human and mechanical endurance under continuous, unpredictable threat. The system was never designed for this. Now we can finally understand why sending the Bush as a third carrier makes sense from a cold, ruthless military systems perspective. Even as the president speaks about the possibility of walking away. The Bush is not just another flight deck. It is a redundancy node in a continuous coverage network. With Lincoln already in theater and Ford recovering from a disruption to flight ops, Bush allows the Navy to maintain 24/7 strike, ISR, and air defense sorties inside the 21-mile kill zone without pulling either of the other carriers off station to rest crews, repair systems, or reposition. In other words, it solves the endurance problem by brute force. This is not a coincidence. This is a pattern. Think logistics. Carrier air wings aren't just jets. They're maintenance cycles, ordnance loading, pilot rest, deck crew rotations, and fuel. Jet fuel, JP5, burns fast. Each FA-18 sortie might last a few hours, but every launch and recovery event requires precise choreography in dangerous conditions. After days of high-tempo operations, aviation fuel lines, catapults, arresting gear, and people all need a break. If you try to run one carrier at peak output indefinitely, you eventually get what Ford just experienced: a non-combat incident, a fire, a systems failure that forces a stand-down and emergent repairs. The cost of pushing a single ship beyond its designed operational tempo can be measured not only in repair bills, but in lost deterrence while the ship goes dark. And this is where the equation breaks. With 3 carriers, the Navy can do something different. One carrier can operate at surge tempo, another at sustained tempo, and the third can sit just beyond the most dangerous zone, rotating aircraft, pilots, and deck crew at controlled rates. Instead of cycling between presence and absence, they can maintain overlapping coverage. If Ford's EMALS needs maintenance windows, Bush's steam catapults can take up the slack. If Lincoln draws the most public Iranian threats and attention, Bush can slip into an optimal launch box where her air wing can push 120-plus sorties a day without broadcasting every movement. The system was never designed for this, but this is how you adapt in real time. Now let's run the cost equation at the strategic level. Oil markets are already jittery. When analysts hear 90% blocked, they don't think in terms of shipping lanes. They think in terms of price per barrel. Historically, serious disruption in the Strait of Hormuz can spike oil prices by $10, $20, even $30 per barrel in days. In this scenario, and with Iranian missiles active and 3 U.S. carriers in close proximity, a single successful hit on a tanker, or even just a high-profile near miss, could push oil past $130 per barrel. That's not a regional problem. That's a global shock. For China, which imports over 70% of its oil, much of it passing through maritime routes linked to Hormuz, this isn't just a headline. It's an energy security emergency. This is not a coincidence. This is a pattern. From Beijing's perspective, a 3-carrier American stack in or near Hormuz is a double-edged sword. On one hand, it secures the sea lanes that Chinese tankers rely on. On the other, it concentrates U.S. naval firepower in a region that distracts Washington from the Western Pacific. Every SM-6 missile fired in the Gulf is one less missile on a Pacific-ready destroyer, at least until stockpiles are rebuilt. Every F/A-18E Super Hornet burning thousands of pounds of fuel over the Gulf is a jet not training for contested operations in the South China Sea. The more the U.S. spends defending tankers and threatening Iranian infrastructure, the more stretched its global posture becomes. And this is where the equation breaks. For Tehran, that is the entire point. Iran cannot win a conventional war against the United States Navy, but it doesn't need to. All it needs to do is raise the cost of securing Hormuz to the point where Washington hesitates every time it considers escalation. As long as the cost per kill equation favors Iran, $1 million per missile to force the U.S. to fire $8 million worth of interceptors, or reposition a $6 billion carrier, the Islamic Republic can frame the game as a war of attrition and political will. The system was never designed for this. So where does the unexpected solution come from? Not from more steel alone, but from rewriting the cost equation. The U.S. is already experimenting with cheaper interceptors, directed energy weapons, and unmanned systems designed to flip the math. A high-energy laser mounted on a destroyer with enough power and beam quality can theoretically engage incoming drones and some missiles at the cost of diesel fuel and wear on optics rather than $4 million missiles. Unmanned surface vessels and unmanned aerial vehicles can patrol the most dangerous sectors of the strait, absorbing risk that would otherwise fall on manned ships. On a single MQ-9B or MQ-4C flying at altitude with powerful sensors can track multiple target tracks over the Gulf at a fraction of the cost of keeping multiple fighters airborne on combat air patrol. This is not a coincidence. This is a pattern. But none of those systems are mature enough yet to completely replace carrier air wings and Aegis destroyers in a full-scale crisis. So, the Navy does the one thing it can do today. It layers mass. 3 carriers, multiple cruisers and destroyers, over 300 SM-6 and SM-2 interceptors among the escorts, electronic warfare aircraft, submarines operating in the background. The Bush adds a proven, high-throughput flight deck that doesn't rely on the same immature technologies that Ford is still validating. In effect, Bush is the insurance policy on the insurance policy. If Ford must limit its sortie rate as engineers monitor EMALS response after the fire, Bush can pick up the slack. If Lincoln is pulled into a forward position as bait or as a highly visible deterrent, Bush can remain in a tactically optimal standoff position. The system was never designed for this, but it can be forced to adapt. There's another layer to this: amphibious risk. If Marines from ships like Tripoli and Boxer are tasked to conduct limited amphibious raids on islands like Karg or along the Iranian coast to seize or destroy missile batteries, they become extremely vulnerable during the initial assault waves. Landing craft and tilt-rotor aircraft, even with defensive systems, are not survivable under sustained anti-ship missile and rocket fire without overwhelming air cover. Carrier air wings must fly suppression of enemy air defenses, combat air patrol, and close air support simultaneously, all while keeping an eye on ballistic missile threats and drones. Doing that with one carrier over more than a few days is asking for a catastrophic gap to open. Doing it with 2 is better, but still fragile if one ship suffers damage. Doing it with 3 gives planners the confidence to commit Marines to high-risk operations without gambling everything on a single flight deck. This is not a coincidence. This is a pattern. So, how does this play against the president's statement that he might walk away? On one level, it's classic coercive diplomacy. By stacking 3 carriers in or near Hormuz, Washington is sending a signal. We are ready and able to escalate at a time of our choosing. At the same time, by talking publicly about de-escalation and the possibility of backing off, the president is signaling to domestic and international audiences that Washington is not seeking war for its own sake. The paradox is the point. The more visible U.S. power becomes, the more room the White House has to talk about peace without looking weak. The more it talks about peace, the more any Iranian escalation looks like the side effect of Tehran's choices, not America's. And this is where the equation breaks. For Iran, the worst-case scenario is a 3-carrier melee inside confined waters that it cannot fully control. Yes, geography favors its missiles in the short term, but if a full-scale engagement begins, American naval and air power will rapidly aim to attrit Iranian coastal defenses, air bases, command nodes, and naval assets. The longer the fight continues, the more U.S. advantages in logistics, ISR, and precision weapons compound. Iran knows this. Its goal is not to start a full-blown carrier war. Its goal is to skate on the edge, using just enough force to threaten, but not enough to trigger an overwhelming U.S. response. The system was never designed for this, and yet both sides are now operating inside this gray zone by necessity. In that gray zone, a single miscalculation could be enough. Imagine an Iranian battery commander, perhaps under pressure from Tehran, launching a larger-than-usual salvo against what he believes is a U.S. escort. Imagine a missile getting through, striking a destroyer, or damaging a carrier's radar systems, even if no ship sinks. Images of a burning American warship in the confined waters of the Gulf would ricochet around the world in minutes. Oil would spike, markets would panic, allies and adversaries would reassess U.S. resolve and vulnerability. China would suddenly face the dual headache of energy insecurity and a distracted, but now enraged United States. This is not a coincidence. This is a pattern. In this context, the question is no longer, why is the U.S. sending a 3rd carrier if the president might walk away? The real question is, can the U.S. afford not to? Without Bush, any major maintenance issue or battle damage to Lincoln or Ford could create a coverage gap that Iran could exploit to ramp up attacks or seize more leverage over global energy flows. With Bush in theater, the Navy has a buffer against the unknown. The cost of moving her, fuel, maintenance, deployment stress, is measured in hundreds of millions. The cost of mismanaging Hormuz and allowing a global energy shock is measured in trillions. The system was never designed for this, but the economics of great power competition force these choices. And that brings us back to you, watching this, trying to make sense of what looks like insanity. Three supercarriers pointed at a narrow, volatile choke point, while the president talks about the option of stepping back. From the outside, it looks like a contradiction. From inside the planning rooms, it's an equation: endurance versus saturation, cost per kill versus cost per ship, deterrence versus escalation, energy markets versus regional politics. In the end, the United States is betting that overwhelming, redundant, visible power will prevent the war nobody actually wants, while keeping the option open to step away if Iran moderates its behavior. The risk is that the very concentration of power meant to prevent disaster becomes the trigger for it. Three carriers in a confined battle space multiply not only U.S. strike options, but also the number of potential friction points. Close encounters with Iranian boats, radar lock-ons, warning shots, misinterpreted maneuvers. Each additional ship is both a shield and a target, both a deterrent and a potential flashpoint. This is not a coincidence. This is a pattern. So here is the uncomfortable truth. The U.S. Navy just sent its third carrier toward Hormuz, not because it wants a war with Iran, but because the current mix of technology, geography, and economics almost demands it. The carriers are not just symbols. They are moving parts in a fragile machine that keeps oil flowing, allies reassured, and adversaries guessing. Whether this machine prevents catastrophe or causes it will depend on decisions made in the dark, in radar rooms and command centers, over the next few days and weeks. The next time you hear a soundbite about walking away from conflict with Iran, remember the reality beneath it. Three nuclear-powered supercarriers, thousands of Americans on deck, and a single narrow strait that can crash the global economy if the wrong missile finds the wrong target. The hardware is already in motion. The equations are already written. The only question left is whether the people in charge can solve them in time. If you want more deep-dive breakdowns like this, where we tear apart the numbers, the hardware, and the strategy behind the headlines, make sure you're subscribed and let us know in the comments what system or flashpoint you want decoded next.